and there's no hell for summer. Please stop the clock, hold back the runner. I'm trying to relax, enjoy myself. Got a few coins, wanna share that well. First round's on me, second round is the sound of the wicked sea.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I am your last step before coffee. So hopefully we can make this somewhat interesting. Most security people who are involved in public safety and your security stay inside the smoke and behind the smoke instead of coming out. Because it is very important that we keep some of the techniques and some of the ideas behind what people know. So I want to talk to you today about security, privacy, and some things to consider. My goal is, before we're done today, to have you think a little bit differently, to think about how you do things. I want to use my predecessor as an example. He was running short on time, and because he was running short on time, he skipped over the security part. Right? Unfortunately, that is very true, that most people skip over the security part, especially in product development, because the first thing we need to do is make it work. Then we need to make it work well, we need to make it work fast, and then if we have time, we worry about security. Well, what happens when we do that? We can get some charts. Come. What happens when we do that? Very often there are very bad outcomes. So first of all, we think about, I want to bring to your attention government entities. So governments, good governments, are responsible to protect and to serve, first and foremost. And they need to balance security, balance our own safety, and be able to stop bad things from happening. How do we do this? By also preserving our own personal privacy. There's always great concerns about privacy. With a show of hands, first I'll ask you, and then I'll talk more about it, how many of you would consider giving up some of your personal privacy to have better safety? To give up some of your personal privacy for better safety? I see only a few hands, which is what I expected. How many of you would say, I refuse to give up any of my privacy to the government for safety purposes? And some people are still deciding whether or not they should or they should not. Well, I want to bring your attention to a few things that have happened in the past, and there's many that happen every day. Some we hear about, some we do not. A few years ago, there was an agency, we believe it's happened somewhere in the Far East, where literally millions of records of confidential nature about personnel in the US government were stolen. And they ended up on some desks in areas in the Far East. Recently, you may have heard about, in the last week, about the Equifax breach. And millions of records of people are somewhere outside of the control of Equifax. I thought it was rather interesting that the executives seemed to just coincidentally sell all their stock in the company a day before this was announced. Of course, just a coincidence. Those type of breaches can cost industry, cost people individually a lot of money. And sometimes even things more valuable than money, our reputation, our brands, which ultimately can have economic consequences. So some estimates that we've seen recently, almost $500 billion in annual costs due to cyber crimes. The average number of cyber attacks that happen on an organization in a week. So globally, and these are the ones that we know about, the average number of attacks that go undetected. I would venture a guess, well, first of all, by the show of hands, how many people have been hacked in some way and found out that they've been hacked? How many people and this is a question you don't need to respond to, have been attacked and don't realize they've been attacked. Of course, you can't answer it if you don't realize you've been attacked. Probably more than half of you have been attacked in some way and don't even realize it. You don't realize that your data has been compromised in some way. So the average cost for one of these cyber attacks to an organization, $11 million. So we don't think very often, even in my job, when we have the responsibility of confidential information, about information on intellectual property of something we may be working on, possibly some ideas for a startup. The compromise of those and other people getting their hands on it could have great financial consequences. So a lot to consider about the potential threats and losses here. If we look at some high-level history, in the early times of these threats, it was mainly for a nuisance, someone wanting to destroy a hard drive, young person maybe seeing, what can they do? Can they exploit a breach in an operating system? Can they exploit something and see what happens? Then some notoriety. Obviously, people want to be in the news and have their name heard in some ways. And moving to monetary gain, it has been estimated that the global cost to the economy for cyber crimes exceeds the international drug trade by almost 4 times. So it's a tremendous amount of money. Unfortunately, the global drug trade is very large. 2, also national security and espionage. And this is where I want to bring together the idea of physical security and cyber security. In many worlds, and in my own, I started out, and I have an engineering background, but I spent a lot of time in the physical security realm, understanding how we can assist law enforcement officers, counter-terrorist professionals in being able to keep our environments and our communities safe. And then I was merged with a cybersecurity team. It was like I moved in with a family that I didn't speak the language, I didn't like the food, we smiled at each other once in a while, but there was no interconnection. And very often we see that today. But the two are very closely interrelated. What we are doing with cybercrime, things that are stolen through cyber activity, and the use of data to be able to stop threats that are happening in our communities today, to stop terrorist attacks. Unfortunately, we hear about terrorist attacks all too often, and we can only hope that they stop. But the ones that we hear about are only a small fraction of the ones that are actually stopped. Of course, we don't want to be too open about how these threats were stopped, because when we do that, they find new ways. So the whole idea is, how do we stay ahead of that threat? So the physical world has to come together very closely with the cyber world in how we keep ourselves safe. A couple other things that may be of interest as far as statistics. When we look at fraud, fraud is a huge business. Many different types of fraud, from bank fraud of people trying to steal our identity and use that in a negative way, to insurance fraud, to banking and ATMs, and so forth. Account takeover to the industry. So people taking over accounts, people somehow taking your identity. Billions of dollars. I'll tell you a story. I was going with my wife to open up an account for one of our children and putting another name on it, and the bank officer started to ask her, "Oh, you have a business in Florida?" "No." I looked at my wife, "Do you have a business in Florida?" "No." Well, she did have a business in Florida, although she didn't know she had a business in Florida, and somebody else was using her name. We had no idea that that took place. And we had no idea how long it was taking place. Now, they used her identity. They were using it for some tax scams. We found out, thankfully, we've got it taken care of. But other people who have had their identity stolen, sometimes it takes years to get that repaired. That fraud situation, sometimes they have not been able to, and they've almost had to change their identity to allow that to happen, or to allow it to be fixed. So fraud is about 10% of the insurance industry's annual losses of people taking false claims, by taking false identities, or being able to do things in a fraudulent way. So how do we start to detect those patterns? How do we start to detect where we see fraud, where we see various types of crime? A couple other statistics. Did you realize, and some of you probably know this, especially in the data environment, is the amount of data that has been produced in this last year is more than all of the data and information that has been produced in the history of mankind, combined. And the amount of times it's increasing beyond that is believed by 2020, 44 times what exists today. And that's probably a very conservative estimate of looking at how much we produce every day through structured data, through unstructured data, which could be multimedia, voice, video, social media, all different types of data that is out there today. With that, there are a lot of ramifications associated with it. The sources of data are multiplying. In the past, cameras, we see cameras everywhere. For the most part, they would record information for some period of time, it would overwrite it, and it was really never looked at unless something bad happened. But now, with video analytics, with vision computing capabilities, we're able to index that information or index that unstructured multimedia stream and turn it into information, turn it into data, turn it into intelligence in some way. So, when we think about what we may be giving up, I'll plant the seed that we'll get into in more depth, is when you walk down the road, when you're walking into a store or a facility like this and you are recorded, you are giving away some information about you, where you are, where you've been, where you're going. And now with some of the capabilities around that, improvements around facial recognition, around analysis and being able to find people by various attributes, we're able to use that in usually an effective way. Some other things to think about for industry leaders. The amount of data that is coming out and our ability to use it in a constructive way, it's becoming overwhelming. And therefore, the need for data science and data scientists. I have been in the industry for over 30 years, so I've seen tremendous changes in the industry. And for a while, people who were database administrators, administering and monitoring and operating structured databases, all of a sudden were termed as data scientists. Not really. It's like saying somebody who passes out Band-Aids is now a surgeon. There's a big difference between the two. And the amount of data and the sources that are coming up, we need to be able to use those in a very effective way. But the performance gap is widening. And as we hear about artificial intelligence, what now is being termed as cognitive computing, being able to work as the human mind, the ability to now look at various analytics. What type of insight, what can we draw out of that information? I found the first presentation today to be absolutely fascinating about how information was being gathered about a population in the US of millions of people to make a determination how someone could progress their thoughts and their ideas to become elected as the president, and what they were able to do and how they were able to advise the election committee for the candidate, who subsequently did become the president. So there are many things that we can draw, many insights, and with that there is a lot of risk. So it's balancing between the two. I also want to focus, I said, about the physical side. More and more people are moving into a city environment, which is also putting higher risks in those environments, making those areas higher value targets for people who want to cause harm, either because of terrorist activity, because of criminal activity. So if you look at some of the largest cities in the world and how they've grown over the years, more and more of our population is moving from an urban environment, a suburban environment, into these urban areas. So it's causing more stress and more potential threats. And here's again where we see that bridge between the cyber world and the physical world coming much closer together. Three key things to think about, the three V's as I call them. V1, V2, V3. Volume. The volume of data, as I said, is multiplying exponentially. The variety and the types of data. So as we are getting more complex analytics, more different types of multimedia data that we're now able to call out information, the variety and the different types of unstructured data is increasing. And then, of course, the velocity, the data flow, and how quickly can we make decisions based on what we're finding. Oh, go back for a minute. One of my previous managers, who I have the utmost respect for, Mr. Bob Griffin, had a term, and I love this term, it's at the top. The promise of technology is that it can move faster than the speed of threat. So the technology that we have can move faster than the speed of threat. But the challenge is how quickly can we, as humans, assimilate what the technology is telling them. So with all the information that's coming in, how quickly can we use that to determine if and when there is a threat? And very often, we find that the time it takes us to determine that is too late. One of the things that we do in a piece of our technology is we look for and we're able to detect abandoned objects. Some of you may remember the terrorist attack that happened in Boston a few years ago was someone putting a backpack down and then walking away. And then we know the outcome of what happened after that. Well, this happens in many areas where something is put down and it could have catastrophic results. So we have technology that can detect when an object is abandoned. But think about that. If I detect when that object was abandoned, if it was intended to explode, it probably will explode before I can do something about it. So many of these things are planned. How can we detect the planning? A few years ago, there was a bombing in, and thankfully no one was hurt, they actually detected it ahead of time, where something was left behind in Times Square. And they determined that it had malicious intent because they were able to detect it in the planning stages. So our ability to take all this data and to be able to watch the patterns and the trends and look for anomalies from a cyber perspective in the data and the activity of data, and look for anomalies in the physical world around us. What is something that is abnormal? Just from a human mindset, I tell my children, if you see somebody put a backpack down in a crowded environment and walk away, it's not a natural thing. You should move away from there very quickly. And sometimes our minds aren't trained for those kinds of things. I have the opportunity and the curse to work with some of the most paranoid people on the face of the earth. And when I talk to them, now when I go somewhere, I look around and I say, somebody could drive a truck through that area. Here's a security breach. Here is someone who went through a security structure in an airport who had a badge on. Geez, I can make one of those badges probably in a couple hours, maybe less, with Google Images. And yet, oh, they're a known crew member. They are? How do we know that that known crew member was not compromised by somebody who threatened their family and said to bring something through that security? All of these type of breaches, we start to get our minds trained. Now we need to train the technology to also think in a similar way. So the volume of data, the variety of data, and the velocity of data that is coming in are causing potentially more threats, but also giving us more ability and more capabilities to detect those threats before they actually occur. But, as we said, very often the security aspects are left behind. We don't see people really worrying about them until something happens. And then they're starting to train themselves for it. I'll give you an example of something that happened. As I mentioned, the abandoned bag detection. One of the examples of what we have. I was going onto a train headed into New York City, and there was a small suitcase on seats and no one sitting next to it, in front of it, or around it. Seemed rather odd. And then people were coming on the train, because we stopped at a station, and as they were coming onto the train, people began to sit in front of it, next to it, behind it. Nobody seemed to think anything of the fact that it was left there. So I finally stood up and I said, "Who does this belong to?" And there was a young lady who said, "Oh, I'm sorry, no one was on the train. I put it there for convenience." It was innocent. But no one seemed to be concerned about this and didn't have that idea because these type of attacks didn't happen in that area. I happened to be in Tel Aviv a little bit before that, and I was talking about this detection of abandoned objects, and the Israeli police had said, "Oh, don't need that." Don't need it? This is an area where threats are a daily occurrence. Why don't you need it? He said it's very simple. Because our citizens are trained, because they know the threats. So if there was an object that was abandoned, he said within seconds, authorities would be notified, people would have cleared away from the area, and they've got that mindset. So in computer systems, in our data analysis, how do we train ourselves for these type of threats? How do we look for these patterns, and how do we deal with it on a regular basis with that volume of data, with the various varieties of data, and be able to use it in a more effective way to protect our assets, our citizens, our environments, and of course, our own personal data? Well, as I said in the beginning, very often people are worried about compromising their privacy and giving up privacy information for security. So I found this comic, which I thought it was rather interesting. If you notice in the center, there is a couple and there's privacy around them, and the privacy is being ripped away to provide a fence of security further on. Is that really what we should be doing? And very often the mindset is, well, I don't want to give up any more of my privacy to some public entity because I don't know how they're going to use that. Are they going to use it for good? Or are they going to use it for bad? How are they going to use that? There's another comic which I found was rather interesting. If you remember a few years ago, there was an attack in San Bernardino, California. And the two attackers happened to be killed during the attack. Unfortunately, they took innocent lives in the process. But when the investigation was occurring, they found that they both had Apple devices, and the government wanted to now crack the encryption on that device to be able to see if there were other attacks in the planning stages, if there were other people that were involved that they should go after. So they initially contacted Apple and they said, Apple executives, we'd like you to give us the keys so that we can unlock this. And Apple said, no, we can't do this. Because if we do this, it can potentially put the privacy of millions of users at risk. So by a show of hands, who thinks that Apple should have given those keys to the government? No one? Not even one? One. Okay, thank you. So therefore, I asked the other question, how many people think they should have? Well, subsequently, the government said, oh, we were able to decode it ourselves. There has been some speculation, and I honestly don't know if it was given to them secretly or if they did have groups to be able to crack that code. I believe, given the skill set they have, they were able to crack that code. Personally, I believe that they should have, and I'll explain why. But one of the reasons why there was fear, right, Apple unlocking the door for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but behind them, right, could that now be used by hackers? Could it be used by various regimes that have bad intent, et cetera, et cetera? So it could open people's privacy up to others that they don't want. Well, I will tell you, when we think about that, privacy and security, well, we want to maintain our privacy. And very often we don't want, and what we said here is just about all of you, said, well, I don't want to give up my privacy. Well, I will tell you, you give away more of your private information on a daily basis than you would probably like to think about or realize in many ways. So when you give away that data, or you make it available to those who have malicious intent. My wife did not give away her identity information to some group to create a corporation in another part of the country. It was stolen. By not giving it to the government or by putting those privacy laws in place, very often we prohibit those authorities, those public authorities, from using that data to protect us. But obviously, criminals are not going to abide by those laws. Others can gain access to it. So I may lock the door on a public official who is now legally unable to use that information for good, but yet I'm not locking the doors for someone who could use it for bad intents. So all these things that we do on a daily basis, social media posts, browsing history. We all have used browsers. I've heard it said, and I believe it to be true, that Google, probably Yahoo as well, but Google more so, is one of the most powerful entities in the world. Why? Why? Has anybody used Google before? Just a few of you. Okay. Free Google email. I have a one for my work, and I also have a Google email. Oh, it's free, so we sign up. It's not free. It's free because to us it may be free, but it's providing value to them. So we are paying by making our data available. Another funny story, a colleague of mine happened to be having some arguments with his wife, and they got to the point where they weren't even talking to each other, but they were communicating via email. And they were communicating Google Gmail account to Google Gmail account, and all of a sudden he started getting these advertisements for lawyers, for divorce mediation, for other ways to split your assets. Just a coincidence, of course, because they're using that data to decide how to market to you. And they could be using that data for many other reasons. What if somebody who has access to all of that information now decides maybe to harm Google, or maybe to use it for monetary gain and take it out of the company? One U.S. citizen who is now locked away in your neighbors over to the north and east is there because he took a lot of confidential information and then made it public. And some of you may have seen the movie that turned him into a hero, that he was exposing all of this data that the government was keeping secret. He put a lot of people's lives at risk and maybe caused the loss of some life, but because of the type of individuals, you don't hear about that very much. So here's someone who is taking that information and out of the company. So even that, patterns of all of us maybe having access to confidential information, what do we do with it? So the security side of it, criminal investigators. The U.S. has some of the most stringent laws in the world to protect criminal information. We joke when we talk to law enforcement agencies that we protect the guilty. So these are people who have been convicted of crimes, and that data is very well protected, but used for security purposes. How do we detect possible threats on citizens? How do we detect fraud and those patterns? Well, some of it is by giving away some of that privacy information or using that private information to protect those people and those assets. But you have to think about, am I trading some of that privacy for security? There was another example, and some of you I was talking about at coffee time, I told about this. I was in a presentation that happened to be part of my team. They were demonstrating some of our technology to law enforcement about being able to track tweets and the interaction of people who were following other people and so forth. And at that time, there happened to be the chief of police for the city of Atlanta. So they asked him to come up, and they said, give us some slang words that are used for drug activity. So he did, and they started to do some quick analysis. And they were able to find people who were using those words in that real time, and who was being followed by them. And by doing some analysis after about 10 minutes, they made a determination that a major drug deal was going to happen in an area of downtown Atlanta. The police chief picked up his phone, he called some of his commanders, and he sent out squads, and they made a major drug arrest based on public information. Thank God all the criminals aren't that bright. But many of them probably thought, how could they analyze that amount of data? This is free, open data. Each and every one of you can go online. There's something called TAC Tweet, and you can do this yourself. You can look at groups that are talking to each other, the various words. You can search on various words and monitor words that are being exchanged and do analysis with this that's open on the environment to everyone. So all of those people are giving away things that they may not realize is publicly available, and combined with thousands, if not millions, of other tweets and social media information can make some determination. So we do, on a daily basis, give away some of our privacy for various reasons. Hopefully for security, but not always. Sometimes to the bad guys. So who can you trust when you do this? So other reasons why we may give away some of our privacy. Has anybody ever used a navigational GPS device? Only a few. Same people who used Google, I would imagine. By doing that, we are doing it because it's convenient. Right? I need to get from point A to point B, and I need to do it as quickly as possible, and I do this. By doing that, I am communicating my location, where I am, where I'm going. Who am I communicating it to? Who has access to it? Other things I may be looking at, targeted marketing, as I said. We're providing search information, things about us. And one of the reasons why I asked our first presenter from Cambridge Analytics about how they did analysis for maybe people who are not using social media. We are all creating some persona by what we put out on the internet. We are all creating some understanding of ourselves. Now the question is it an accurate understanding of who we are or not? And in some cases it may be, because it's a combination of a lot of different things. In some cases it may not be. I do a lot of work helping youth, teenagers, young adults, and I have a young person who works very closely with me. Wonderful individual, and he happens to live out in the woods in Pennsylvania, and he's a big hunter, and he happens to be rather conservative. But if you look at the things he posts online, I've advised him, I said, no one will ever give you a job. He said, what do you mean? I have free speech. Yes, you do. And guess what? All of those people who are looking at your credentials, they have the free access to look at your free speech and make a judgment of what type of individual you are, and they may consider you to be too extreme for a particular job. So when you look at that, what persona are you leaving behind? Another show of hands, how many people have Googled themselves? Just a few? Some. More than before. More than the people who have done navigation. I would suggest that all of you Google yourselves, Yahoo yourselves, any other search engine which you may feel comfortable with, and do it on a regular basis and find out what comes up. I had an employee of mine who I sent to Puerto Rico for a project. He's a PhD in vision computing, in accessibility. He's been in that field, and he's been a PhD probably for 25 years. Very well known, very well published. And I got a call. Said, your employee is in jail. What did he do? Well, he did something we found out about 30 years ago. So when he was in college, he happened to be drinking one night and went out with some friends and destroyed some property. Nothing really too serious, but they found that in his background. So when he went to the police force, this person has a criminal record. I never knew he had a criminal record. So I had to can I speak with him? What did you do? Well, I really don't remember exactly what I did. They told me I did this. I was too intoxicated to remember. And anyway, he was cleared of that crime. But the reason I mention this is that he had some aspect of his life that really was no longer important in reality. And it was something that was cleared, but it still was a mark on his record. And now, with the ability to access not only current data, but older data, it makes it more difficult for us to be able to hide these things. We may have a persona that we don't want to see. I was asked to speak at the Polytech in Lviv the other day, and interestingly, the professor, before I got there, asked the class to find information about me. And some of what they found was true, and some of it was not true because it was somebody else with the same name. I happened to look a little similar, so they were telling me some things that were true, but some were not. So when you look at what comes up with your name, what do you want to show? What are you giving up? Because anybody can look at a lot of that information. So how much of your privacy are you giving away? So when we think about not wanting to give up our privacy to government officials, we do have to consider how much of our privacy we give up willingly for the sake of convenience, or that we don't give up for the sake of willingness, but that it is now available. And that's how we get personalization. That's how we understand how cars may be marketed to us, or how we may be influenced through elections because of what they have found out about us. So it's very important to think about what you are giving up for the sake of convenience. We live in this world. The idea behind that is privacy has to be deliberate now. It can't just be governed through the sake of laws, and we can't say we are going to put very strict laws in place, because very often that stops the good guys from protecting us. Now, there are oppressive regimes and so forth and can use it in bad ways, but by the way, the hackers, the people who may be threatening either our assets, our lives, our property, our businesses, our intellectual property, they are not governed by these laws. So privacy has to be deliberate. You need to take an active role. As all of you being savvy in the technology world need to think about how you will protect your own privacy. What do you put out willingly? What do you make available that is okay because it's fairly innocent? And what things do you want to protect and not make available? And what things that may be out there that now you want to push down? There are ways and techniques to say, this is something maybe I did, not terribly proud of, or it doesn't really show the aspect of who I am, and I want to push it down on the search engines. There's ways to do that. But when we think about this, we also need to think about who are these bad actors? Who are these individuals who may be gaining access to this information? Cybersecurity, cyber threats, and physical threats are in fact real in every corner of the world and in every aspect of the technology of life if we are connected in some way. When you start to look at this, sometimes you will say, okay, I want to cut off all wires. That's why in some very, very secure areas, I've been in situations where I cannot bring in a phone, I cannot bring in a laptop. Everything that has any ability to connect to the outside world has to be left behind when you enter so that nothing can be taken out. And who I referred to earlier as Mr. Snowden, this person that is, what he did would probably be very difficult to do today. Because think about this, here's someone who had access to confidential information, confidential records, and he had a certain pattern of what he was doing. Now, all of a sudden, that pattern changed by him doing a download of massive amounts of information, which is something that's not natural. So it was an insider threat. So threats come from the outside, but they can also come from the inside. You as business owners, as either large established business or new established businesses, what are your core assets and how are you protecting them? So it's something that we need to really take into our own concern on a daily basis. And unfortunately, as we said, it seems to be the thing that's left over that we don't think about until the end if we've got time. So public sector infringing on our privacy, yes, it's important, but nowhere near as bad as the bad actors that are out there in other ways. So I want to, as we're finishing up, I'm just running out of time here. Has anybody heard of Mr. Frank Abagnale? Anyone? Yes, a few people. There is a movie that was called Catch Me If You Can about his life. I had the opportunity to listen to Mr. Abagnale speak not too long ago, and Mr. Abagnale was a crook, and he was a really good one. And he traveled millions of miles and made millions of dollars. Didn't cost him a thing. He impersonated a pilot, a doctor, lawyer, many different things. He flew around the world in the cockpit of Pan American planes. I can say that because they're out of business now. He said he never flew the plane, but he got on by watching, understanding these people. So they asked him, what would you do today if you were in the same role? Now he has spent the last almost 40 years of his life using his skills as a criminal to be able to help the government from stopping some of these crimes. So they said, what could you do with technology today? He said, I could have turned tens of millions to hundreds of millions. And they asked for an example. He said, well, I'll give you an example. I can go into an airport and I can take a picture of you, and then I can go to something called PitPat, and I could look and see if I can do a face match, and then I can determine who you are, and through some casual conversation, ask you about your family, where you're from, your birthday. He said, with a few answers, I'm 90% there from stealing your identity. Casual conversation and a simple picture on the phone. So things like this can happen, and I won't have time to go through all of the details here, but really what we need to consider, because each of us leaves this giant trail of digital exhaust in everything we do. We leave things behind through social media, through our daily activities of what we're doing, how we're being recorded. How are we going to monitor and protect that? So to end, I want you to think about, one, how you take control. As I have all of this digital footprint of things that I'm involved in and accessing, how do I cultivate and monitor how I'm using them?